On the Nature of Consciousness by Ludwig Klages. Chapter 1. Life and the Concept of Force. The extraordinary importance of the question about the nature of consciousness may be seen from the following remark. If we understand the word in its original sense as a substantivized activity, I am conscious, open bracket, of a thing, close bracket, then we can only know something at all because of that power or gift which gave us consciousness. May the knowledge extend to the world of appearances, to the soul, to consciousness itself. Therefore, for example, whoever undertakes to determine the conditions of cognition must either determine the conditions of consciousness, or he has determined nothing at all. The widespread dogma of the insolubility of a question, the answer to which would obviously be the insight of the threshold at the knowledge temple of psychology, points back to millennia-long wrong ways of metaphysics, which of course no one can avoid to pursue who seriously strives for a solution. Provided, however, that he has sufficiently uneducated eyes, he will notice that the terrible difficulties, of which the basic concepts seem to stare, were invented by the need of force of the spirit in the historical man, and that it is not to discover unheard of new things, but rather to tear apart the densely meshed net of self-deceptions, in which, as excellent participants, however, almost all philosophers have knitted and woven along. It was an interest, even if of a suprapersonal kind, which seduced the thinkers to confuse life with spirit, and thus in step from the very beginning to confuse reality with being. But after they had evaporated the reality to a kind of reappearance of the spirit, it did not remain unavoidable that they, thinking about the soul, found only the consciousness instead of it, and exhausted themselves henceforth at the hopeless task to spin out of the consciousness also its enabling reason, the experience. The one who has seen through this error of approach soon sees himself surrounded by a penetrating clarity, in which the self-contradictions of orthodox science disintegrate without his intervention. The following explanations shall serve to open such a perspective, or, if one wishes, to lead it to the threshold. But then finally we will show that the question about the nature and origin of understanding requires the answer to the other question about the nature of life, and that each of the two can be decided only in relation to the other. Thereby, as if by itself, the much disputed problems of soul and spirit, reality and being, living body and quote-unquote dead matter shall find their completely definite solution. Our explanations are not intended to be exhaustive, but only sufficient, and thus make considerable demands on the reader's intellectual cooperation. However, in order to make the reader, as well as those not technically trained, at least to some extent familiar with the prehistory of the examined terms, we will climb up to the actual findings on the detour of the refutation of widespread false doctrines. Refutation of the vis vitalis. The natural scientific theory of life, biology, presupposes the problem of life instead of solving it. It deals with a group of things which it distinguishes as living from others as non-living, but has no answer to the question in which the being alive of the living thing consists. But it has no answer to the question in which the being alive of the living things consists. There is no essential characteristic or quality by which the living differs from the non-living. All colours, sounds, smells, taste, tactility, shapes, forms of movement are basically found in the same way in inanimate as well as in living things. Finally, as far as the statement is concerned, first given by the Pythagorean physician Alcmaeon, centuries before our era, that alive is that which moves of itself. That alive is that which moves of itself. Then with it, however, an expressive characteristic of life, but not a property of living things, is correctly designated. For even apart from the fact that the objective movement does not tell us at all where it comes from, certain considerations which are obvious today substantiate the impossibility of the self-movement of things. With it, we come to the refutation of the assumption of a so-called vis vitalis, or life force. Force is the cause of a change of velocity, or the condition thought as possibility for the fact that ponderable masses receive immeasurable acceleration. By the assumption of a life force, therefore, the performances of living things would be assigned work values which do not originate from the energy supply of the physical universe. But with the theorem of the conservation of energy stands and falls the very concept of force which would have supplied the pattern for the supposed explanation of life. However, the name should not disturb us, if only our justified expectation could not be disappointed to see the famous perpetuum mobile realized in the life carrier. Refutation of the nisus formativus. One tries to meet the above difficulties in vain by saying, for instance, the life force is not a mechanical force, but a quote-unquote principle, which prescribes to the existing forces the path of their unfolding. It would thus be a kind of quote-unquote directional energy. Alone one can give a deviation from its direction of movement to a moved body only by push or pressure or pull. If the waters of a river change their direction at a certain point, this is due to the magnitude of the resistance of the embankment, i.e. to a fundamentally measurable counterpressure. This becomes clear to us if we imagine that the bank wall gives way and the course of the river continues without a change of direction. If, for example, as a result of a cloudburst, the force of the water masses exceeds that counterpressure. Moreover, the concept of a quote-unquote directional energy is based on an inadmissible dependence of a mere characteristic of the force phenomenon. Direction, speed, mass are three very well distinguishable, but not separable, facts. If, however, the quote-unquote directional energy cannot be maintained, then the nisus formativus, according to which the liveliness of living things is to be searched for in a self-forming force, also falls away. Chapter 2. Consciousness and the Concept of Force. Refutation of the Theory of Interaction. Let us immediately consider the quite similar difficulties which arise from the above wrong assumption for the conception of the connection of corporeality and consciousness. Already Descartes has invented the directional energy in order to bring his conviction of the strictly mechanical causality of the course of the world into harmony with the quote-unquote freedom of the will, which was not less important to him. He assumed that the consciousness residing in the pineal gland, for him completely the same as the soul, could not set the bodily spirits of life in motion, but could change the direction of motion of the already moved ones. Likewise, the consciousness was exposed to certain disturbances by the spirits of life, perturbationes animi, which, coming into effect as movements of the mind, would result in confusions of knowledge and sinful decisions of the will. From this developed, admittedly only much later, the theory of the interaction between consciousness and body. It is impracticable. For on the one hand, the measurable energy of numerous bodily processes would then be generated from the immeasurable fact of consciousness of acts of will, physically seen therefore from nothing. On the other hand, the measurable energy of all bodily stimuli would vanish into nothingness, insofar as the immeasurable fact of consciousness, for instance, of concepts, would arise from them. Refutation of the psychophysical parallelism. The inconsequence of the master was too obvious in this point to have escaped the students. Julinx, completing the separation of consciousness and body, unhesitatingly decided in favour of the much-discussed evasion of embarrassment that at the occasion of the act of will no less than God causes the corresponding movement of the human body. At the occasion of the physical stimulus, the corresponding conception in the human consciousness. Occasionalism. Spinoza fell for no less wrong, but considerably more spiritual attempt of solution. According to him, unextended consciousness and extended being of the same thing, substance, are only two distinguishable sides, which complement each other with unbreakable legality. Quote, "The order of connection of thoughts is one and the same with the order and connection of things." End quote. It is the fundamental for his whole system. Prejudice, brought as seventh tenet in the second part of his Ethics. Wherever there are bodily movements, there is also some corresponding fact of consciousness, and wherever there is a flash of consciousness, of whatever it is, there are corresponding bodily processes. For this reason, the doctrine has been given the quite unsuitable name of philosophical pantheism. Only Leibniz unintentionally revealed the fraud, which was veiled by Spinoza's artifice, with his famous, quote-unquote, pre-stabilized harmony. If the facts of consciousness and the processes of the body always accompany each other flawlessly, without the need of a divine mediation, then this comes from an original provision of God, according to which both behave to each other similar to two clocks synchronized with 1 second precision. The clock parable originates from Julinx, only he still wavered a bit about the assumption of an original divine provision, and the other assumption that God intervenes regulating from case to case. Leibniz then decidedly gave the preference to the latter. From this developed a doctrine of psychophysical parallelism. Consciousness and body do not act on each other, but to every nerve process corresponds a consciousness fact belonging only to it. To every consciousness fact, a nerve process belonging only to it. Well, it is wrong for the following reasons, among others. A. Here indeed a divine watchmaker would be presupposed, thus faith, not knowledge. B. But it would not explain anything at all, for one could obviously think away the one as well as the other of the two systems, the mental or the physical, at will. Without that, the remaining one would be broken. C. But the assumption is even impossible, because it cancels its own presupposition. This was namely, two systems, consciousness and world, whose mutuality relation should be explained. A consciousness existing for itself, however, would know only about itself, and not the least about a world facing it. Refutation of ideologism. The objection raised in the last place is moreover suitable for a devastating criticism of every kind of ideologism. Berkeley, Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, etc. As it is astonishing for the still uninitiated when Schopenhauer opens his main work with the words, "The world is my imagination." If he would be right with this, then it could no longer be justified with any means of thinking how man ever came to the obviously erroneous belief in a world, which is something else than merely his imagination. And indeed, since the Indians, or since Plato, no mortal has ever even seriously tried to do it. But because ideologism flatters the spiritualizing instinct, not to say the spiritual arrogance of historical mankind, we must, in spite of its groundlessness, already here linger a moment for its refutation. If I look at the empty tabletop before my eyes, then I can quote-unquote imagine many things which could have a place on it, e.g. a bowl with juicy fruits. But as far as I imagine such things, I am not able to perceive it. And if now suddenly the bowl with fruits would stand in front of me with the table serving for its support, no matter whether actually or only imagined, then at that very moment my being related to it would have lost the character of imagining, and would have exchanged for it the character of perceiving. The human being may perceive many things which are not really present here and now, illusory perceptions and hallucinations, but nobody has ever confused his perceiving with his imagining. Our imagining can refer to something. Our imagining can refer to the perceptible, but to conclude from this that the perceived itself is something imagined would be at least as absurd as if one would consider the fact that even illuminated things shine as a refutation of the existence of original sources of light. Another is the perceiving, another the imagining, visualizing, thinking. Both processes can never take place at the same time with regard to the same object. The assertion that what is perceived as something imagined is the most unnatural of all inventions that the philosophically educated man has concocted. Such a folly would never be taken seriously if it did not seem to fulfill the hybrid wish of the spiritual man that the whole earth with its billion-fold life, yes, the whole universe with its myriads of celestial bodies, would be a product of the intellect, differently belonging to him, and thus justifiably abandoned to the claims of rule of human arbitrariness. What it comes down to with this twisting is the derealization of the world of appearance. Here we need to pursue the difference of imagining from perceiving only insofar as necessary to bring the absurdity of the beginning to light, and for the purpose we point out that the object of perception, as well as the dream image, has the character of a present reality, whose existence and suchness that can be found is only to be confirmed by the consciousness. Whether I perceive the lion rushing toward me in the waking state, or in the state of dreaming, I find myself both times opposite an event which is completely independent of me, and which excites characteristic feelings in me both times. Completely different if I imagine the same event. Then the present reality to which I again see myself referred is different from the object of my imagining or thinking. Therefore it carries the incomparably different character of an image from my inside. This is true even for the so-called compulsive imagination, which imposes itself, but nevertheless proves to originate from the soul. Perceiving, I experience the perceiving state of consciousness as directly conditioned by something par excellence foreign to the soul. Imagining the imagining state of consciousness as directly conditioned by me, since the indirectly felt compulsion to it always comes from my own soul. If what is imagined would always be realized instantaneously, then we would know nothing of an activity of imagining. And if what is perceived would appear to us like something imagined, then again, nothing of reality. We will come back to this further below, and in the meantime keep in mind that the ideological belief in the consciousness affiliation of the world of appearances falls only more into the fate of the, quote, psychophysical parallelism, end quote. Namely, to make impossible what it pretends to want to explain, the assumption of a consciousness-independent existing world.